So far, it's been a busy November for both Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump. They have wrapped up their specific Asia-Pacific tours, during which their keynote speeches, leader summits, have dominated the headlines. After almost a week, what's the impact? America first or the Chinese dream? Take a look at this.
They have been offering competing visions since the beginning of the year at the Davos Forum to the recently concluded APEC meetings. U.S. President Donald Trump stuck to his America First agenda, complaining free trade had cost millions of American jobs.
We are not going to let the United States be taken advantage of anymore.
While Chinese President Xi Jinping won applause by reiterating China's open attitude towards free trade and globalization. China has proposed the Belt and Road Initiative and has founded the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, attracting members not just from the Asia-Pacific, but also from Europe and Africa. On the contrary, Trump has pulled the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a major trade deal with 12 APEC nations, arguing it would hurt U.S. economic interests.
If the TPP is actually approved, it will be catastrophic.
On the sidelines of the APEC meetings, trade ministers from the 11 remaining members agreed to proceed with the TPP, leaving many to wonder if the world is getting used to the U.S. withdrawal. And the U.S.'s growing reluctance in global governance has left an America-sized hole to fill. So will China be the one to take on more responsibility?
For more on this, we are joined in Washington, D.C. Scott Kennedy, who is the director of the Project on Chinese Business and Political Economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also editor of the recent book, Global Governance and China, The Dragon's Learning Curve. Mr. Kennedy, welcome to our program.
Thank you so much.
One thing people wonder, that is the international system that we are talking about right now is the one that is being built after the Second World War. But it is not just the international system itself. It's an abstract word. If you look at some entities, specifically the IMF, the World Bank, they are governed by board. And the board is made up of economies and countries who have different proportion of shares and therefore of decision-making rights. So we are not talking about some abstract entities vis-a-vis the rise of emerging economies such as China, but rather economies that might have conflicts or opportunities of cooperation with economies rising such as China. So, Mr. Kennedy, are we not necessarily tackling the real issue, but rather hide behind an abstract word which is called so-called international system?
Well, that's a good question of whose interests does the system represent, and is that reflected properly in the leadership of these institutions, or also the institutions or rules that don't exist that need to be challenged. Certainly, the IMF and World Bank have gradually adapted their leadership in terms of the voting power of their members. The IMF took a little extra time, in part because of the U.S. Congress, to change its voting to give China a greater share, and that's going to be adjusted again next year. But, you know, these are systems, organizations in which everyone needs to contribute or look for additional solutions in organizations. I think the creation of AIB is one of those types of efforts that tries to fill a hole or address issues that the World Bank wasn't addressing, and some of the reforms that AIB is proposing may encourage the World Bank to change and become better. So the growth of new institutions is supposed to be a positive challenge to existing ones to make them better. Some people talk about fragmentation of the system, which is certainly something one needs to be concerned about, but pluralization of the system, I think, is something to be welcomed, particularly when global power seems to be pluralizing as well.
On the other hand, what about the United States? You know, one of the major builder of the so-called international system that are still relevant today. It seems to be going bilateral by this administration, and therefore, is it going to be relevant to the so-called international system if the builder of the system already withdraw who else would hold on to it?
Sure, that's a great point. Systems need leadership, and the U.S. and Europe provided a lot of leadership after World War II to create multilateral institutions that govern trade, in the financial system, and foreign aid. I think what we're seeing now are strains in the United States about who are the winners from this system, and I think this is partly a result of growing inequality in the United States, part of which is being blamed on globalization, and maybe some of that is true to some extent, but there's also just an anxiety about the world, and that's why I think the Trump administration has moved in this very sort of defensive crouch position, which we saw in the very different type of speeches that President Trump and President Xi Jinping gave at APEC just last week. Hopefully, the U.S. Finds a new balance that reflects the importance of the system, that it needs to be reformed and not discarded, because it's been obviously mutually beneficial for the United States, for China, and for much of the world.
When you talk about so-called the new balance, a phrase you just used, Mr. Kennedy, where would that come from, the inspiration for the United States to hold on to it, something like a new balance, Mr. Kennedy? Explain, please.
Sure. Well, I think the U.S. obviously has benefited tremendously from this system. It's also a big provider of global public goods in this system. In some ways, the U.S. global trade deficit that it's had for a long time has encouraged countries to export and helped growth everywhere. The dollar-based system has also facilitated global trade and investment. But I think that within the United States, if you go around this country, you'll find people in different industries in different states who are highly anxious about globalization, who see the obvious job losses in their sectors, but not the gains that also come. And so I think the Republican and Democratic parties, interest groups in the United States are trying to figure out how can you make sure that we have an inclusive growth.
But you know, Mr. Kennedy, the word inclusive certainly is beautiful, but it depends on whose inclusiveness are we talking about. When the system is not in the favor of the builder, for example, the United States talk about so-called inclusiveness, but I guess that inclusiveness is about domestic inclusiveness rather than inclusiveness of the other economies, because the other economies, Mr. Kennedy, are actually benefiting right now to a certain extent from the current existing system. So is the United States trying to change the system fundamentally, once again, bring it to its own favor?
I think the U.S. is trying to make sure that this system works for everyone, including the U.S. I think that, you know, you have to remember...
Come on, Mr. Kennedy. The U.S. is trying to make sure the system is going to work for everyone. That just sounds beautiful. Sure. Remember, at the very beginning of building of the system, right after the Second World War, not everyone was being consulted, not even like a big country like China, but rather a few powers decided on the fate of the current system. How can you expect the United States now, quote, work for everybody's favor? Is it realistic, or is it too naivety that we're talking about here?
Sure. Well, okay, if we go back to the end of World War II and this system that we have is a political compromise. The U.S. and Europe didn't agree on everything, and this system has evolved and changed over time. Most of the changes that the U.S. has been pushing, if we look just before Trump's arrival, with regard to TPP, was about filling in blanks in the system where there weren't any rules related to, example, for state-owned enterprises, for investment, for e-commerce, and those creation of those rules in some ways benefit the U.S. because they have a comparative advantage in some of these areas, but at the same time they are really much more important than they used to be, and having clear rules will be beneficial to everyone. So we even see in RCEP, an organization that China is trying to help create, addressing some of these rules, and the WTO as well. So everybody, my hope is that the U.S., China, and other large powers see that their stake is in the system, in reforming it, not in exiting it, because that would have massive detrimental effects to everybody. And so, you know, I'm concerned about those nationalist populist voices that we hear in many quarters.
But Mr. Kennedy, the question really is, will the rest of the world wait for the United States while your country is trying to struggle out a kind of a united solution within your own politics, or the rest of the world going to move forward on their own without the United States? And what would that mean to your country?
You're absolutely right.
And to the others?
Yes, I think Tianwei, you're 100% correct. That's why we see negotiations continuing forward with the TPP 11, in RCEP, in other organizations. So the U.S. Has a strong benefit from active participation, and I think there are some in Washington who hope that, you know, the current turn in American politics ends after 4 years and the U.S. becomes internationalist again. But by 2020, the rules will have changed, and it won't be the same. You know, when you stick your foot in the river at different times, it's a different river. And so the U.S. is going to need to step up and show additional leadership. This concern about bilateral trade balances is not probably sufficient, in my mind, to address the big concerns that we face from global organizations and that they need to tackle. There are many bigger issues that need to be addressed. And of course, integrating China into this system is a crucial part of what we need to focus on.
Integrating China into the system, many wonder, Mr. Kennedy, is that too late a phrase already to be used? Because China is already part of the system. China is even working with the other countries leading on some of the initiatives that you just mentioned yourself. So it's about integrating China into the system or reintegrate the United States, if the latter is willing to do so, into the system again.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Obviously, China's been an active participant in global governance institutions since at least the 1980s, rejoined the UN in the early 70s, and China holds leadership positions across the system. I guess when I'm talking about integration is, given the size of China's economy, it's just simply the gravity of China's economy, the economic weight it has an effect on who gets what in lots of different industries and sectors. China's overcapacity issues, for example, affect global markets. And so the rules and the systems need to be adapted so that we can have a flexible system that somehow deals with those kinds of challenges that are simply just the product of China's size, not even just the type of policies that it pursues. But in addition, you know, China is highly concerned, for example, about the stability of the international financial system.
Right.
That's a system which is focused on liquidity. And so there's adaptation, whether it's for China or for the system or for existing players. I think everybody is in need of figuring out how to reform the system.
When we talk about the international system and the way it should work, I guess one of the things it could learn is about why some of the countries or economies are doing well while others do not necessarily so. If that is one of the standards people can use, and then it would be important for the system to study what is going on in China, because after all, this economy is doing relatively well. So whether the standards that were used before, the models that were used before, the examples that were used before in portraying the existing system are still relevant to us anymore, or actually many of these poles, standing poles, has to be moved and changed, Mr. Kennedy.
Sure. Yeah, that's, I mean, that's a debate that we are working through in real time right now.
Exactly.
The fundamental foundation of the international system post-World War II was that openness to the global economy was beneficial not only for those that opened their economies, but for everybody else in. And I think there are exceptions that are built into the rules in cases of the environment, protecting national security and such. But this idea of openness being critical and beneficial to everybody. And then to the extent that countries face problems, that's part of their domestic politics to resolve. I think the rise of China suggests an alternative to some extent where it's, you know, although it's openness at a very gradual pace in certain sectors where the state plays a larger role. That's a conversation that because of China's successful example, we are seeing occur at the WTO, in other institutions, and certainly from the 19th Party Congress, where General Secretary Xi focused on the idea of the Chinese example and experience for others. And so that's why we are seeing a great debate about the role of the state and the importance of openness.
Mr. Kennedy, at the end of the day, when we talk about the international system, we don't want to be just politically correct. We want to go to the bottom of this. What exactly is the deciding factor, after studying the so-called international governance for such a long time, Mr. Kennedy, is deciding on the fate of the international system? Does money speak? Is ideology the ultimate, deciding factor? Or is it about a kind of thought leadership that would eventually deciding on the fate of the international system? What exactly is it, Mr. Kennedy?
Tian, I think I'm going to give you an unsatisfactory professor-like answer, which says all of these things matter.
Okay.
Power, money, interest groups matter a lot. The other thing, diplomacy, your diplomatic skills, both officials and non-state actors in NGOs. There are diplomatic skills to know the written and unwritten rules. Actually, China has performed remarkably, even in situations where it doesn't have a lot of hard power. You'll see, of course, just your ability to adapt and learn, the flexibility of your domestic institutions effect. So I don't think what we have is a straight line direction where we're headed. We've got multiple competing factors that are shaping the direction of the international system. I hope that the competition over ideas is going to proceed peacefully, and that competition should be welcomed. And in 10 years, if we come back and talk about this, hopefully we'll see a system that is adapted to address some of the big challenges that not only the U.S. and China face, but the world faces, because without that type of adaptation, just the problems are going to get larger, and the differences are going to grow.
Mr. Kennedy, I wonder, Mr. Kennedy, I wonder whether that really takes 10 years, as you just said. At the end of the day, when there is dramatic change in the world, there are likely to be vacuums. Those vacuums are likely to be filled by new players. In order to debate and deciding on the fate of these vacuums, there's likely to be competition, and there's always possibility of cooperation. What would you mean? What would you say about this, the nature of what we are experiencing right now? If I go back into my country's history, to me it sounds like the Warring States period of time. There are so many thoughts going on, so many different possibilities where a country and the world can go. From your American experience, where are we? Where are we going?
Sure. Well, I think there are concerning signs about fragmentation of the system, views that the system doesn't work for us, and the rise of nationalist, populist movements. But I think what has to be done is argue that this diversification is a positive, pluralistic movement, and those who see the benefits of globalization and how international institutions have helped need to make their arguments better domestically and vis-a-vis others. And so I think that's an important balance or conflict that we're having right now. I think the global system has largely been beneficial, although there's some that have not fared as well as they should have, and to me that speaks to the need for reform, not junking the system. And there's this big debate within countries, between countries. I think China has provided a lot more public goods than it used to in the past. It used to primarily be a recipient of those. But what type of public goods are needed? How should they be provided? What organizations should do so? The Belt and Road is an example of one new effort in that direction. And so obviously that is a key individual aspect to watch going forward. And hopefully the U.S. and China and others will try and figure out how to make the Belt and Road and other initiatives to build infrastructure work for everybody.
Scott Kennedy, the editor of the newly published book, which is called Global Governance and China, the Dragon's Learning Curve. We are all, I guess, on a learning curve. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching.